we're going to talk all about Aida. And if you're an Aida stitcher, this video is going to be great for you, and you should be proud to be an Aida stitcher. Don't ever let anyone shame you because you use Aida, because I use Aida all the time. So in today's video, we're going to talk about different sizes of Aida and how you can determine that, different colors, different brands, different feels, all about Aida. We're just going to talk all about everything. And it is a live stream, but I'm not going to answer questions until the very end, and that will keep me sticking to all of the points that I need to cover. So just keep putting your questions in and super chats or whatever, and I will get to those at the end. I'm not ignoring you. I'm just going to make sure that I stick to the script. So we're going to first talk about what Aida is and look at different Aidas. So when you're looking at this video, we have put the brand, the count, and the color in case you want to buy that at Fat Quarter Shop. So Aida is an even weave fabric, meaning the fabric fibers have an even number of webbed and warped threads per inch. Warp runs the length of fabric, and weft runs side to side or selvage to selvage. And an Aida count is determined by how many squares per inch. The smaller the count, the larger the squares because you have fewer stitches per inch. When you're stitching with Aida fabric, you will stitch over 1 square, and the count of fabric you use will determine how many strands to use and what size needle to use. At Fat Quarter Shop, we have the cross stitch calculator, and you can always go to that and you just put in your stitch count that you want. You put your stitch count of your piece and the type of Aida you're going to use, and it will tell you what size needle we recommend and how many strands we recommend. So you would use your cross stitch calculator to look that out. Look at that. You could also look at our cross stitch key, which also has that information. So it tells you number of strands and needle size. So we're going to start off with Aida counts, and I'm going to show you how to demo that, how to count it. So we're on 14 count. And the easiest thing is if you have a cross stitch key, we're looking, this is 14 count. And if you look at that, you get 14 stitches to the inch. That's how you know it's 14. So if we count it across, it would be 14, but also these lines line up so you don't have to think. So we can tell this is 14 count. Another way is you can use the ruler side and count per inch. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So you can either just use a regular ruler, and there's 14 squares to the inch. So I'm going to also show you that on some other counts. So that's 14. This is 10 count. So like I said, the count of fabric will be different. Let's see. The Aida count is determined by how many squares are in the inch. So the smaller the fabric count, like 10 count, the larger the square. So you can see 10 count has larger squares than 14 count. And then, so I'm going to leave 10 here, 14 here, and 16 we get even smaller, and you can see that. And so if you have a fabric in your stash and you don't know which size it is, you just pull your cross stitch key or your 1-inch ruler and you count the number of squares per inch, which is what this is. So that's 16. And then 18 would be here. Now, if you pulled your fabric out and you thought, okay, is this 14 count? If you put your 14 count here, you can tell immediately that it's not lining up over in here. Like you can tell the lines are off. And then 20 count. These are even tinier. Okay, 20 count is not on the ruler, so you would just look here and count your squares. So hopefully that makes sense. So now we're going to look at it as a whole. So when you look at it, your 10 count is going to be your largest squares and your bigger stitches. 14 count is the most commonly used. 16 count, your stitches are smaller, smaller, and even smaller. So your fabric is bigger on the 10 count and smaller on the 10 count, meaning you have bigger stitches all the way to smaller stitches. So that's all about stitch count. And remember, at the end of the video, I will answer any questions you have on stitch count. But remember, go to our cross stitch calculator if you want to know the number of strands to use per size of Aida or the size needle that you need. And those are, that's on Fat Quarter Shop's website at all times. So that's all about stitch count. Let's move to brands. So we're gonna now talk about different brands of cloth in Aida, and we're gonna go from least expensive to most expensive. So Charles Craft is made by DMC. It's widely available at local craft stores, so you could find it like at a Michael's, Joann's, Hobby Lobby. You can even find it at Fat Quarter Shop. It generally comes in pre-cut fabrics. So the pre-cut size we have here is 15 by 18 inches. Here are some examples of it in 14, 16, and 18. It usually comes pre-packaged in a tube. It has limited colors, and it is the least expensive of all Aida. It is extremely stiff though. And if you're working with it, your hands might get kind of scratchy or dry, and that will factor into your stitching. So the stiffer your fabric, the harder it is on your thread, and that will create fuzzing or shredding of your thread, and it will also create dry hands. But if you are on a budget, Charles Craft is definitely the way you want to go. And also, if you're just wanting to stitch something, you know, low budget, Charles Craft would be what I would pick, and it is made by DMC. So that's our first brand. Our second corporate brand is Zweigart. Zweigart makes lots of cloth, and they're the most well-known in the industry. It's available at most needlework shops, meaning if you go to a cross-stitch store or if you go to Fat Quarter Shop. It is available in either pre-cuts or by the yard, depending on which one it is. So if you go into, for example, Shepherd's Bush, which is a needlework cross-stitch store, they would have lots and lots of Zweigart because it's the brand that kind of was, it's kind of the elite brand that's always been around. You can distinguish Zweigart because it always has an orange thread or stripe in the selvage. They have a ton of colors. They have a few geometric designs, but not many, but tons of colors. And they have, this would be a specialty print, but just so you know, this is very sought after, the white petty point, but it only comes in 18 and 20 count and does not come in 14 count. We get that question a lot. But their Aida does come in 14, 16, 18, and 20 count, except for this one. Zweigart's Aida is not as stiff as Charles Craft, and I would consider it a very standard priced fabric. So if you look, like when I'm feeling it, you know, it's much softer than this. Like you're not gonna get, it doesn't even move. But Zweigart is, if you are starting cross stitch, it's a great one to start on. I use it all the time, and it has kind of been around the longest. So now we're going to move. We talked about Charles Craft, Zweigart, and now I'm going to show you some of Lori Holt's vintage cloth. So Lori has Zweigart prints. What she does is she takes the Zweigart color card that they give manufacturers. She picks the colors she likes. She renames them and brands them under her name. That way you can easily find them. They're easy to buy. They're available at Fat Quarter Shop. They come in pre-cut sizes. And she has 10 count and 14 count. So Lori hand selects her colors, and she hand collects them based on her vintage style. The fabric is manufactured by Zweigart, so it is the same quality you saw in the cloth before, and you can tell because it has the orange line. But in Aida, Lori has 10 count and 14 count. And it's a limited colorway, but it is like a very solid, good colorway, and it's got really good colors to pick from. And now we're going to move to Witchelt. Witchelt, just like Zweigart, is available in most needlework shops. It comes in pre-packaged pieces. And for Aida, it comes 18 by 25 is the size that they cut their Aida. It also comes by the yard, sometimes it doesn't. Witchelt makes Aida in 14, 16, 18, and 20. Witchelt Aida is stiffer than Zweigart, but not as stiff as DMC Charles Craft. This is the brand I use the most, and the reason I use it the most, well, this one and Fabric FLAIR, but if I'm using a solid color Aida, I usually use Witchelt. I like a stiffer Aida, but this is kind of the stiffness. So it is softer than Aida. It is softer than Charles Craft, but stiffer than Zweigart. They do have a very soft Aida called Country French, and it is a very soft feel. So if you're looking for something in Witchelt that is soft and more malleable, that would be called Country French. And then if you can see how it's very soft. And then if you pulled a similar count, you can see that it's not as soft. Witchelt is one of my favorite brands because I like the stiff Aida, and the price is very reasonable for the amount of stitching that I do. So I consider it within my budget. So now we've talked about some of the larger corporate brands. Now we're going to move to smaller brands that are smaller companies. These next brands are small businesses that add hand-dyed or screen printing to the base fabrics we just talked about, resulting in beautiful fabric offerings, and they are usually more expensive. So I'm going to show you Fabric FLAIR. They have a ton of interesting and unique prints. It's available a little bit at needlework shops, but more at online shops. They offer their Aida in pre-cut 18 by 27 inch pieces or 19 by 36 inch pieces. They offer all of their colors in size 14, 16, and 18. Fabric FLAIR looks like it's hand dyed, but it's actually screen printed, and they do screen printed dyed effect or geometric prints. And you can tell which is the correct size because one side has the print and one side is solid. Fabric FLAIR and Zweigart are a similar stiffness. This is my second. This one in Zweigart is what I use the most because I love the style of the fabric. I prefer to have I like to stitch a lot of my designs on white, but I don't want to use a white. So I end up using a lot of these prints right here. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. One tip I would give you if you're working with fabric FLAIR, this is screen printed. So if you sat here and scratched at it, it would start flaking off. So I would be careful if you're using one of their solids, just to be careful with your Q-snap so that it doesn't like flake off too much. I've never had an issue with it. It's just something to look out for. And I love their fabric and love that something like this is offered so that you don't have to use linen. You can use Aida and have a beautiful, beautiful finished piece. Now we're going to move to hand dyed. So at Fat Quarter Shop, the brands that we have the most hand dyed of are Picture This Plus, Fiber on a Whim, Fortnite Fabrics. We also have some other companies, we just don't have as much of them. All of them are dyed on a Zweigart base, and you can see that from the orange line. This one doesn't have the oh, there it goes. This is available at most needlework shops. So needlework shops are really known for the variety of hand dyed you can get. It's available in traditional Aida sizes of 14, 16, 18, and 20. And since they're all custom hand dyed fabric, and if, just so you know, if you buy, for example, Affogato Fiber on a Whim today, and then in 6 months you buy another Affogato Fiber on a Whim 14 count, they will not look the same because they're hand dyed. So no two hand dyes will match ever. Some of the companies serge the edges so that it doesn't fray. Well, most of them do. So even when you're looking at hand dyed, one side of the fabric will even look different than the other side. The fabric is very soft on all of the brands. It will be the softest of all of your fabric brands. So, and we're going to talk about different hand dyed colors in a little bit. Now, I wanted to let you know at Fat Quarter Shop, Picture This Plus has a 12-month delivery. Fiber on a Whim is easy for us to get, or the easiest for us to get. So we try to use them the most just because we're able to get it for you as a customer most. And like I said, it's available in all the counts. And today I'm just showing you the 14 count. And just remember, in the video, we have everything labeled for you. So now I'm going to show you some hand dyed examples. So let me show you these colors first. So this is Affogato. This one, Affogato by Fiber on a Whim. This one is Picture This Plus Tycho, T-Y-C-H-O. And I'm going to show you each side just so you can see the beauty of hand dyed. Now, hand dyed fabric is very expensive because it is hand dyed by actual people with actual dye that costs money. So it is much, you know, very much more expensive. Fortnite, this is Fortnite Fabrics. Heirloom is the color. And I'm just showing you 14 count today, but 16 count will dye differently, 18 count will dye differently, but even 14 count today versus tomorrow, even on the next section of the bolt, it's going to look different. Now, Fiber on a Whim, we picked some Fiber on a Whim 6 colors, and what we picked were brighter, bolder, non-beige, you know, just so you can see the look of what you can get, how wild and crazy you can get with hand dyed, or you can stay basic like I just showed you. This is Espresso by Fiber on a Whim, and this is showing very true to color, and some will be variegated, some will be less variegated. Old Gold by Fiber on a Whim. And you can always, with your fabric, do a floss toss, meaning put your floss on top of your fabric to see how it will look, or kind of look, stitched. So this is gold, Old Gold. Ivy. So you can get all kinds of colors. You know, we've got browns, reds, blacks, grays, browns. Oh, okay, I'm going to do these to this camera instead. Am I going to redo the others? Okay, so that's Ivy. Peony, this one's so cute. Have to use it one day. Tuscan. Stream. So that's examples of hand dyed fabrics. So those are examples of that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move to top 5 neutrals that are commonly used. So these are just 5 neutrals that we think a lot of designers use and we use over and over. But these are just top 5 neutrals. So we've got Vintage Country Mocha by Zweigart, Lamb's Wool by Witchell. And if you want to know what counts they come in, you would refer to the earlier part of the video where I tell you what sizes those brands come in. Icelandic Gray, Beautiful Beige, and Ivory. So these are neutrals that are great to have in your stash because they are just such great colors. Now these 4 are solid on both sides. Vintage Country Mocha is mottled on one side and solid on the other. And the solid is also beautiful. So if you're looking for maybe a solid that's in between Lamb's Wool and Beautiful Beige, Vintage Country Mocha is a great option. So those are 5 great neutrals you can find at Fat Quarter Shop. And then now I'm going to show you the top 5 fabric FLAIR. And this will be great for you to refer to when you're looking for fabrics. You can kind of just look at the screenshots. So this is whitewashed board, thin white pine board, pale gray gingham, and I use this all the time, marbled white pine board, and waxing moon dyed effect. So you can see the difference in the wood grains on all of those. I'll kind of separate them a little bit. But we went in our system and looked at what are the top 5 selling fabric FLAIRs. Then we looked at top 5 sellers at Fat Quarter Shop all over, and I'm going to go in order from 1 to 5. So the best-selling fabric by far, it's actually by a large margin, is Chalkboard Black 14 count. And I am sure the reason it is the #1 fabric is due to Priscilla and Chelsea. So thank you to them. The second bestseller is Oatmeal 14 count by Lori Holt. The third bestseller is 14 count Pale Gray Gingham. Our fourth bestseller is Marbled White Pine Board, 14 count. And our fifth best seller is Antique White 14 count. All of our top sellers through number 17 are all 14 count. Number 18 starts out at 16 count, but by far we sell 14 count more than anything else over and over and over again. So if you're looking, this would be great to kind of have in your stash because it's a lot of variety. We've got a great beige, a great dark, and a great just plain white. Antique white sells much better than just plain white. And then these two I happen to use a lot. So those are our best sellers. Now I'm going to show you my most used 14 count. And of course, some of this is going to overlap. But my most used is 14 count Chalkboard Black. If you look at my house, that's most of my smaller pieces are made with that. Pale gray gingham, I use, if I'm using a white, I'm more likely to use pale gray gingham than anything else. If I'm using a brown, I use Vintage Country Mocha or the Lori Holt Oatmeal. Thin white pine board, I'm loving a lot. We use that on the Home Sweet Home that we use for Cross Stitch University, and I loved how it, for Mania, and I loved how that came out because this is the one that you can actually, once you stitch on, you still see the design. And then my other favorite is Marbled White Pine Board by Fabric FLAIR. All of these 14 count because that is what I love to stitch on. And we looked through all of my journals to look to see what my most used are. Now you're going to want to join us next month on February 7th because we're going to do this same type of video on even weave and linen. So any questions you have on even weave and linen, we will cover February 7th. And now, thank you for being patient. I'm going to answer all of your questions. What 14 count color alternative to Lori Holt's Prim Lugana she used in Prim and Proper? I don't know actually the answer to that, but I know we have the Prim in stock. I don't think she's done Prim in 14 count, so I can maybe ask her if she would be willing to do that. I don't know the color alternative. Laura B. FlossTube says, I'm not sure I can tell the difference between Witchelt and Zweigart. That's okay. Zweigart has the orange line, and to me, Witchelt is stiffer, but I think that Witchelt is less expensive. D. Beckman, please tell us how many stitches you cross for each count. I usually stitch over 2 squares. When you stitch on a high count, do you stitch 1 or 2? So on 14 to basically go to the cross stitch calculator so I don't tell you incorrectly. So yes, refer to our cross stitch calculator, and it kind of depends on what you're doing. When you get into 18 and 20, there's a lot of things you can do. So I would refer to the cross stitch calculator. Karen Brunette asks, what count do you suggest for a beginner? I definitely suggest 14 count for a beginner. Do I iron my cloth before I begin? From Debbie Flaw. No, I don't. It kind of, once you start working with an Aida, another thing I didn't mention is it will soften and the wrinkles will come out. I don't get any creases out before because it kind of becomes malleable and it will soften on its own, but you can iron before if you would like. She also asked, how do you figure out how big of a piece you need to make for your project? Well, you go to our cross stitch calculator because we had that question so much, and you enter it in and it will tell you if you put the number, how many borders how wide you want your border in, just use the cross stitch calculator. It's kind of like the dictionary. So I would just go there and it will give you your answer. What would be an alternative for 14 count Lori Holt Cloud? white or antique white. Thank you to Super Chat from Diana or Diane Stodola. Thank you. I'm going to answer all the questions on delivery dates last. Is Waxing Moon more of an orange or a yellow? Let me hold it up for you. Cheryl uses it a lot. And I think that might be why it sells so well. So I would say it's more of a beige. Yeah, I would say it's definitely more of a beige, but it definitely has, I think it does have a tint of orange and a tint of yellow, both. But when I first look at it, I see like a softer beige. Debbie Mastis asks, how hard is it to dye your own and which is the easiest to dye? So I would, I think that to dye them, it would all be the same technique. I would go to Priscilla and Chelsea's video called FlossTube Tea Dye / Coffee Dye. Priscilla and Chelsea, the Real Housewives of Cross Stitch, and they do a tutorial there, and it would be the same technique for each count, but I do think you get a different result with each. And any kind of questions on tea dye, I would refer you to Priscilla and Chelsea because they are the pros at it. And the reason they tea dye is because they stitch so much, they don't want to pay the heavy price for somebody else to dye it for them when they can dye it themselves. What type of project would you put on the ones that aren't neutrals? Would like to see Kimberly's kit some with those fabrics. So when we put our kits together, we sometimes include the fabric and sometimes we don't. I kind of stick with those 5, but we do bring a lot of Cheryl's pieces in to show you different design options. Megan says, thank you for answering my question. Do you have a suggestion for a comparable color of fiber on a whim to picture this plus sand? I would email Cheryl, CHERYL @fatquartershop.com, and she will answer you. She only works Monday, Wednesdays, Fridays, so if you email today, you'll get an answer tomorrow. Can you recommend a more sharper black alternative to Chalkboard Black? Yes. Witchell has a black. It's just called black, and it is great. Now, what Priscilla and Chelsea stitch on is Monaco black. That is no longer made. They think the most similar is the Linda cloth black in terms of feel, but I would say just Witchell black. I usually see size 24 needle to use on 14 count. The cross stitch calculator shows 26. Is that because you stitch in hand? That's just my preference and Cheryl's preference, but I don't think it matters if you stitch in hand or if you don't. When we did the calculator, we built in what I think is best and also what Cheryl thinks is best. Okay, I'm gonna do some fabric delivery questions. When do I expect 14 count marbled white pine board to be back in stock? January 20th. ETA on fiber on a whim, cream and sugar. Probably a month. They don't take too long, so we can make sure I have it on order, but yes, shouldn't take too long. Rhonda Lawrick, if you're stitching with one thread, how long should it be? Mine keeps knotting. So for thread, I like to cut mine at 1 yard. So 36 inches, but I fold it in half and start with 18 inches. So I think all of that's also personal preference. If it's getting too knotted, try 5 inches shorter and then 10 inches shorter until you get your basics. What is the best neutral that shows white thread? My white stitches get lost in so many neutrals. So I think the very best neutral is Vintage Country Mocha, because it has a darkness to it and you can use either side. Can I talk about how much Aida has changed since the 80s and 90s? I started stitching in the mid 1980s and Aida was all there was that I can remember. There's still a stigma about Aida, and I don't know why, referring to Aida being substandard to linen. Kimberly and Sambry Stitches are hardcore Aida stitchers. Maybe have her do a guest visit and talk about Aida. So, yes, it would be great to have Sambry Stitches on as a guest. I was just a guest on her channel, January 1st, if you want to check that out. But since the 80s and 90s, I would say Aida used to just come in basic colors. Now it has a lot more colors. But the base cloth is the same. I do think it's offered in more sizes, and obviously hand-dyed fabrics were not a thing in the 80s and 90s. Screen printed fabrics were also not a thing in 80s and 90s. So fabric flare, all of the Picture This Plus, fiber on a whim, all of that is new. I find working with stiffer Aida, my thread tends to shred. Should I change my needle or to a less stiffer fabric? I use a hoop. Zweigart, fabric flare, and hand-dyed fabrics are less stiff, and your thread will not shred your thread too much. I think all of that is also personal preference. So for example, I just love to stitch on Witchell and fabric flare. That's a personal preference. I also love to stitch on 14 count. That's a personal preference. Cheryl loves to stitch on Zweigart and hand-dyed only. That's a personal preference. Everything is personal preference. And so when you're working on any type of hobby or anything in life, whatever works for you is what you should do, because you'll have the most success with it. So just go with what you like and what you think is best, what's in your budget, and just whatever you like is what you should do. Will you get more colors in 18 count? We only carry 18 count fabrics that customers request. So you can use the product request form to request a color. 18 count does not sell very well for us at all, so we just keep it on a limited basis. Will there be more colors with and without the dots on 14 count in 2023? So the Petty Point by Zweigart I showed at the beginning of the video only comes in 18 by 20. Other manufacturers have attempted to make a white that is just as good, and I just don't think it's been as successful. I can't predict what manufacturers will do, but of course I personally would love to have a white Petty Point on 14 count. It's just not made yet. I'm just starting to cross stitch again. Is there a right and wrong side to Aida fabric? The only ones that have a right and wrong size are fabric flare, because it's screen printed on one side, and Vintage Country Mocha, because one side is modeled and one side is not. Is Aida cloth grain directional? Will my stitches look better if I stitch with selvage side rather than perpendicular? No, I don't think it makes a difference. How do I choose cloth for patterns? So I would normally just pick the brand I like. I would put the fabric down on the table and do a floss toss. Earlier, I gave you my 5 most used, and normally I just start with that because I have had success stitching on that and know that I like that. A lot of people, on the other hand, strictly stitch what the designer calls for. So if Hands-On Design puts on there, you know, I stitched this on Affogato fiber on a whim, some people will just stick entirely with what the designer stitches. So it's a personal preference. I stick with 14 count Aida and sometimes other cloths, but I start with what I like, and that's how I stitch. Some people just start with what the designer calls for and use that. So I think it's kind of personal preference and whatever you feel most comfortable with. Can you soften Aida? I recommend, if you want it soft, buy a hand-dyed because it's already soft. I don't think you can, I don't know if people would soften that at home on their own. I would just recommend buying something hand-dyed if you like soft, or the French Country by Witchell because that is soft. And I don't think you can soften Aida. It does, you know, loosen or get softer as you go. I'm new to stitching. I was wondering how you choose which Aida to use. So I have kind of talked about that, but also one thing I haven't mentioned is I love 14 count because I like how the thread lays on the fabric. When I use 16 and 18, I feel like the thread is too maybe bulky. So it's all preference, stick to what you enjoy, but I love 14 count. Okay, we have a couple more questions. E. Martin asks, what brand of Aida is loosely woven to see the holes? I find some Aida is tightly woven. I think, so for me, the softer the fabric is, the harder the hole is to see because the threads loosen. So if you want to really see the holes, I would go with maybe a stiffer fabric. But I use Fabric Flair and Witchell and never have trouble finding the holes. Ilsa Rojas, when do you think Zweigart 3270-779 can arrive? It's like wheat. We'll look. Email Denise at fatquartershop.com and she can answer you later today. Kathy asks, is there any way to prevent shredding? I'm stitching on 18 count with one strand and it shredded my thread. So I have two tips. One tip would be start with a shorter length of fabric. I would also, you could use a thread conditioner like Lori Holt's beeswax. You could use beeswax of any kind. On Etsy, they sell lots of thread conditioners that will stiffen your thread, but my most successful would be to use a shorter thread length to start. It does not matter if you stitch vertically or horizontally. And I think that's all the questions we have, but we love our customers at Fat Quarter Shop. We're happy to answer any questions. If you put the question in the comment box, we will answer, and we would love for you to like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow.